Okay, so just welcome everybody to this Wisdom of the Guide, which is a time where we basically discuss one of the Pathwork lectures. And the Pathwork lectures were channeled by Eva Paracas, like in the beginning of sort of this new age time, like back in 1958 was when she first started, and she passed away in 78. So and there's like 249 of these lectures plus some Q&As and additional material that was, I think, really sort of the beginning of this download into the earth plane of a lot of things that we take for granted in our culture today, sort of the connection with the body and all of that, body psychology. Things came out of Esalen, things that came out of other spiritual paths that came in about the same time, from other places. And so it was kind of this time, I think, of a real download of spiritual energy on the planet. And the Pathwork lectures, basically the guide says that, it's this influx that's coming in to help us take the whole evolutionary arc of humanity sort of up a notch, that it's a kind of time for a transformation of humanity, and that we, by exploring these lectures can discover what our personal part of that is, and also be a part of, helping in this collective. So I'm going to go ahead and share our screen and bring up the lecture. Does anybody have any questions about that or anything else you feel I should say? So I don't know if that's easy for people to see or not. I try to make it so we can kind of read along for some people that like to stay, with the visual, but feel free also just to listen. And basically what I like to do is, read a little, comment on it myself, welcome any questions or comments from anybody else, and feel free to break in if I seem to not be ending and, jumping over a section that you wanted to, make sure that there was something you needed to bring out. So it's pretty, fluid and just follow along. And you can connect with all of these lectures at pathwork.org, which is the International Pathwork Foundation website that has the copyright for all of these. But this one is an early lecture, number 25. It was delivered March 14th, 1958. And it's kind of sort of the beginning introduction of this as a path and the initial steps, preparation, and decisions that, are involved in sort of connecting with this kind of work. So we ready to launch? Everybody good? It says, greetings in the name of God and Jesus Christ. I bring blessings for all of you, my friends. From all my preceding lectures, you will have understood one thing clearly: the necessity for self-development on this earth plane, which exists for that very purpose. No matter how difficult life may be at times, only those who fulfill this purpose can find peace in their souls. I have promised to start this course on development so that each one of you can find your way by learning how to go about it, where to begin, and what is involved in doing the work. Moreover, I want to tell you before I begin that many of the words I shall give you in these particular lectures can be treated as a meditation. You should read words and not just read them once, for that will not be enough. You should meditate on these teachings so that knowledge may eventually grow from being superficial and intellectual to reaching the deeper regions of your being. Only then will they be really beneficial to you. And so, it's like, for me, every time I read a lecture, I get a new piece out of it. So, that's one of the values, I think, of having teachings like these. And, the pathwork doesn't say it's the only teaching, right? And supports many of the other teachings, but it has a certain thing that it adds, I believe, that is especially useful for us, from the West as well. It kind of comes out of our Western cultural tradition. And so I think it sometimes is more accessible for us in some ways. So everybody knows that it is important to be a decent person, not to commit so-called sins, to give love, to have faith, to be kind to others. However, this is not enough. In the first place, knowing all this and actually being able to act on it are two different stories. You may be able by voluntary action to refrain from committing a crime, such as stealing or killing, but you cannot possibly force yourself to feel that you do not want to harm anybody ever. You may act kindly toward another, but you cannot force yourself to feel kindly. Neither can you force yourself to have love in your heart or to have real faith in God. Whatever pertains to emotions is not dependent upon your direct action or even on your thoughts. Changing your feelings requires the slow process of self-development and self-recognition. You may realize that you do not have enough faith, but realizing this and trying to force yourself to have it by telling yourself, I must have faith, will not bring you one step closer. Quite the contrary. Superficially, you may be able to talk yourself into it, but this does not mean your faith or your ability to love is real. It is already a great accomplishment for people of lower spiritual development if they can be brought to not committing wrong deeds. But there is certainly not sufficient for any of one of you here. Much more is expected of you. Primarily, this path is about changing your innermost feelings. How to go about that is the question that we have to begin with. There I can show you the way. In the first place, my friends, you cannot change anything as long as you do not know what is really in you. The greatest difficulty on this path is that people tend to fool themselves about who they really are. Now, I'm not only talking about the subconscious mind, which you all know exists. I will not even go as far as that. Between the conscious and the subconscious mind, there is another layer which is much closer to the conscious mind. However, you are still unaware of this layer because you want to be unaware. You escape from it, although its symptoms and signs may be right under your nose. People flee from such awareness because they mistakenly think that what they do not know does not exist. You may not think so in exactly these words, but feelings of this sort go on in you without you quite realizing them. However, these hidden feelings exist. So even if you turn away from your own inner reality, your temporary reality of this present time, this layer is still part of the reality of your life and your present state of development. So I'm just kind of curious, like, how all of that lands. I can remember when I first came across the pathwork, sort of this, work that he's describing here, this, becoming more aware and not really knowing ourselves and sort of being afraid of seeing what's inside, felt like it took me a long time. Like I could really, feel the resistance that I had and some deep fear inside of me that, I didn't really want to see, so I don't know if that relates for anybody, or maybe, it feels like, oh, this is really great. You've been, looking to, be able to know yourself more fully. The pathwork is definitely a path of self-knowledge. And when we have a lot of inner judgment, then oftentimes we're afraid to really face and see ourselves, because rather than accepting ourselves, seeing it with compassion and understanding, we tend to judge it and make ourselves wrong and, sort of punish ourselves in some way or another, right? And so it's kind of like we're running a lot from this awareness, because it seems like there's a lot of inner critic that gets involved with it. So does that make sense? Anybody have any comments at this point on this? So you may all remember the lecture I gave some time ago about the higher self, the lower self, and the mask self. What I have explained is part of the mask self, but it is not only a mask. I may call it the exterior self, which does not always correspond to the inner person. All of you know that it is wrong to do or think or feel certain things. If these feelings still exist in your lower self, you turn away from them, thinking you have thereby eliminated what you recognize as wrong. Avoidance or denial is the greatest mistake a human being can make, for it causes infinitely more trouble, more problems, more inner and outer conflicts than anything you know in your conscious mind. I have often mentioned the various spiritual laws which are constantly being violated by human beings. Now, can you feel like some finger pointing at you when he says that? It's very tricky because internally, we have some of these programs. And so I found for me, it took a while to read the guides, words in a kind of loving voice and an understanding of the, positive and encouraging, and welcoming voice that he had. Really, it's like it's the internal part of us that's shaking a finger at these, and I don't think it comes from the guide. But I used to listen to these lectures originally, and I would just kind of cringe inside. And then I did hear somebody reading them out loud, that was reading them with a much more, gentle and loving voice. And I realized, oh, that's the voice inside of my head. And it's good to see that. So, here, where we're realizing and trying to, face somehow that we're far from living, within the spiritual laws. We don't even know, and we're violating them quite a lot, and unconsciously. But it's not like, that's some kind of, cardinal sin that, then, we should be punished by. It's more like, oh, we're living in ignorance. We're confused, and we're making, mistakes in our judgment, because we don't really understand and are miscalculating and that kind of thing. So it's by learning more about those laws, and then seeing more consciously how we have this sort of tendency within us, to go in a different direction, and again, without judgment, but, to just be, supportive and conscious of it enough to, forgiving enough, to continue to work, to choose to make a different choice, and to move on this evolutionary path. And later on in this lecture, he talks a lot about, it's like, it's not an overnight thing. So, he says the process that he just describes, violates one of these laws. That's the law of facing life. So if we avoid facing life, right, it's sort of violating a spiritual law. And to face life's reality means to be able to face yourself as you are with all your imperfections. And if you do not face life first, can't really develop. No system trying to teach ways to jump over this hurdle can ever be really successful, for seeking the shortcuts violates a spiritual law. On the other hand, like there's also people that I think, they don't jump over their perfections, but they use their imperfections, but they use their imperfections in a way of kind of self-recrimination and of shame and of, self-judgment. And so from that place, it's also really hard to do anything useful, and positive with the transformation of anything, because, it just takes us into this, place that, has trouble accepting it. So, besides the self-knowledge, you have to have self-acceptance in a very deep way, both of your divine reality, that higher self that is your essence, but also of all of the other parts of us. And to really understand, to me, what the Pathwork is saying is, like this earth plane is here for that, and we're not coming here to be perfect. We're coming here with these imperfections to live life with them, experiencing the consequences and trying to understand more deeply and eventually, transforming them. So, it's almost like these are the part of our spiritual mission, part of our spiritual task is to bring aspects of consciousness that are separated from truth and the light and wholeness, all of these things, that are, feeling like it, has to be selfish, has to defend itself, all of that, that's, like a way that then we contract and then we can't participate in, the larger capacity for life that we're kind of being called to in this evolutionary process. So part of it is like learning, how to face ourselves and to work with the fears and the resistance and the contraction and the things like the shame and self-judgment that, happens. And as we, work with this, it's just, something that we can, like in a fishbowl, examine in ourselves. And so, group work and just individual sessions kind of explore all of these things. So to face life's reality means to be able to face yourself as you are with all your imperfections. If you do not face life first, you can never develop. No system trying to teach ways to jump over this hurdle can ever be really successful, for seeking such shortcuts violates a spiritual law. All of you are unconsciously following this harmful process all the time. Even though some of you may have already gained a certain amount of self-knowledge, there is not a single one of you who has not had at least one realization about an incident that has made this trend really conscious. Nevertheless, in many other areas, your conscious mind still flees from facing the inner truth. You may even know your shortcomings, but you certainly do not know all your real motives. I see that a lot, people naming that and then kind of like shelving it, or, instead of being curious, okay, well, why am I that way? Or, what is it in me that, is holding that space or feeling that need, to be in that stance. So we can really keep exploring and excavating inside of ourselves to know ourselves more fully. And to really understand our motives and to realize that often there are mixed motives, and contradictory motives within us is also very useful to begin to understand and see. So he says, you do not understand why you have certain opinions, tastes, or idiosyncrasies. Even your good qualities may be partly influenced by an unconscious fault or inner wrong. These trends and tendencies about which you have hitherto deceived yourself have to be understood with respect to the influences and connections they have. There's nothing in the human soul that comes entirely from the higher self or the lower self, because everything mixes constantly. Purification means to separate, understand, and rearrange in conscious understanding all these various trends, thus purifying the basic good trends from all masks of self-deception and from influences caused by character weaknesses. The higher self in you says, I want to be perfect. I know this is the will of God, but it is the ignorance of the lower self that makes you think perfection can be attained by turning away from your imperfections and disregarding them. It's also the lower self that wants to have everything so comfortable. The lower self wants to be in a high position, but for different reasons than the higher self. Your higher self seeks to advance for the love of God by way of recognition and enlightenment, aware that only when you are perfect will you be truly capable of loving your fellow creatures. But your lower self wants to be perfect in order to have more ego gratifications and to swell its head to be admired. All of you, without exception, also feel this way. So, and like this is where, when he would throw things like that in, it would be, a difficulty sometimes for, there's ways that the language, kind of also even feels a little bit harsh, where we hear ego gratification and to swell its head. Many of us have been shamed for our kind of narcissism, as well on this path. And so, there's a kind of double-edged sword with it. But it's really true that, if we can just embrace ourselves as the human beings that we are, and know that whatever is in us is how God made us, or what we came with to work with and to explore, then we can let go of some kind of judgment against ourselves that I think causes a lot of. So here's an example where both the higher and the lower self want the same thing, but their motives are entirely different. So did that make sense? Anybody want to comment here? Let me pause. Is this making sense? Are people good with this? Thumbs up. So sometimes these things have more, of a, and maybe later on as we get into it, more of a discussion potential, but I like to leave some room for it in case. So he says it's of utmost importance for the purification of your personality and for the sake of a healthy and harmonious soul to separate your motives and to recognize their voices. Do not feel I am blaming you, nor should you blame yourself when you begin to recognize these trends in you. I am stating a fact, and one of the basic requirements for your path is that you accept the fact of many negative trends still existing in yourself. Only from this premise can you go on and change the impurity of your motives. You must also recognize the reasons why your lower self turns you away from facing yourself. One reason is that to recognize yourself as imperfect is unpleasant. The other is that the lower self is lazy and never wants to work. Yet it requires work to face what is in you, especially when it comes to facing the unpleasant things. So the first step, my friends, in your decision to walk the path of self-development and purification, become clear about this. It is the greatest decision a human being can ever make. You may have already made it in another path or another, right? So I don't think this applies just, but I think he's saying here just to walk a spiritual path in general, right? It is the noblest of all fights humanity can ever engage in, but you must do so with open eyes. Therefore, realize what you ought to expect and what you have to search for. Start to search for perfection immediately. This again would be unrealistic because you cannot attain perfection quickly without having time and effort. This search is the first and most important half of the truth of the path. If you proceed well on this part of the path, you have won half the battle already, and even more friends. If you realize this, you will not be discouraged or busy on this first half of the work that is necessary. Reach perfection only by going through your imperfection, not by going around them. You should meditate on this daily until such knowledge becomes part of you and until you are imbued with this truth. Furthermore, prepare yourself that going on this path does not mean a constant improvement of yourself and your life conditions. This again is completely unrealistic. It is necessary for you to face the fact that the path is long and that repercussions and times of testing will not cease as quickly as you would like to believe. You may say at this point that a great deal of harm is being done when people are led to understand that by following certain rules of metaphysical teachings, their problems will altogether cease, or that if they appear to cease for a time, that will prove a sign of success. There are many people who appear to have no outer problems whatsoever. Such people are certainly not on this path. They may be of lower development, less is expected in this incarnation, and who have been given a chance to prove what they can do with an easy life. If they do not do their best now, they will have more difficult times in the future. Perhaps so they can prove themselves. But to imagine that going on this path of purification will immediately lessen your troubles or problems is immature and childish. Certainly, your outer and inner problems will lessen and finally cease, but only after a long time and after you've first thoroughly understood your inner makeup and rearranged your inner currents. In this way, you will dissolve inner images that are directly responsible for your conflicts. So, it's like it sounds a little discouraging in some ways, but I think he may also say in this later, but I just want to add it, here that there really is a distinct, improvement, however, and just to understand and know a little more about, what's going on when you are hitting like a kind of a recreation event, or you're struggling in a dynamic that seems like it's been with you all your life, just have a little more perspective on it and really understand what's going on. To me, it's a huge shift, gift, to just recognize, oh, this is just where my work is right now. This is something bubbling up for me to pay attention to and work with. And, it's also a kind of real reality, when I think of certain issues that even now I'm uncovering deeper and understanding more and working on all this time in one way or another. But it seems like a kind of cycles, like layers of an onion, and you get to clarity and it shifts something, but then there's even deeper levels that you get into. So, it feels like as we do this work, a lot is freed, and a lot in that freedom then is a more joy, more lightness of being, more, health and that kind of thing in our lives. But also, that there, something that, we came in, it really is a lifetime journey. Sometimes I talk about like that life is really a soul initiation. Sort of our ego doesn't get that and thinks it's like supposed to be a vacation. And so we want, things to always work out perfectly and kind of be in this kind of adolescent, I think, fantasy a little bit, of life. And partly the guide is saying, and many people are speaking this now, that our whole Western culture is a little bit pathologically adolescent, and we have to grow up. And this is a part of what the guide is so pointing to. And he talks about, our immature child consciousness and that. So once you have attained some victories over yourself, you will fully realize this truth, but it will take a long time and years of work. Then very gradually, the times of trial will lessen in impact and frequency as harmony grows in your soul and as you take charge of yourself and become aware of who you are. When I say aware of yourself, I mean knowing your lower self utterly and completely. It does not have to mean that you have overcome it completely. When you start on this path, my friends, you ought to meditate every day before you do anything further. Meditate on the fact that you can expect to find aspects of yourself you may be shocked. Expect this and meet halfway instead of hiding and escaping from it. You have to realize he's also like channeling this in the 1950s, right? And so people were even more in their masks and denial back at that time. So some of this is maybe less appropriate, in our era, and we have kind of more sensitivity and more, sort of self-judgment about all of this that we have to work with. But back then, it was like people pretty much, believed in their masked self, and didn't like to go very deep inside. And I don't think they really knew what to do with it, so partly this, I think the guide was coming to help us move that. So when we expect, to encounter our imperfections and meet them halfway instead of hiding and escaping from it, then just as we have had tests before we started on this path, they will come our way. But the difference is that a person on the path will, after some successful work, understand that each testing and each time of woe, challenge, squeeze, passage means something very specific, particular message that there is something quite special to learn about the self is conveyed by each difficult period and every hardship. I really like that. I think it's like really important to try to explore and trust that that's the case, that every time we're undergoing some hardship or difficulty, that there is a message that is, something to learn about ourselves that's trying to break through in that, part of what's connecting and activating relationship. So only after a considerable time will your mind be trained in this direction so that you will find out faster and faster what the lesson is. The moment you will understand the significance of these periods, the particular testing will cease. As long as you have not understood it, the testing will be there. It may recede after a while, but it will come back in the same or similar form until you have learned the lesson. Those who have experienced what it means to understand the message of a particular hardship, to really understand it to its core, will realize what a blessing it is. Then what I am saying here will not be merely be words, but a deep experience. Cosmic, anybody? Questions, comments?
Darlene, we have a bit of a audio problem that we don't typically have. There's
Yeah.
a sort of a thudding going on in the background, and occasionally a word or two skips out while you're speaking.
So let's have everybody mute except for me. See if that helps. Yeah, I think that got rid of it. Okay, so just remember to unmute if you have something to say. So meanwhile, the person who is not on this path or who has perhaps not completely found his or her way to the path and is still in the first stages will be at a loss, not knowing why he or she has to go through all this, makes the hardship infinitely more difficult to bear. I think I skipped something. Let's see. Oh, basically not. Yeah. It's talking about how when we, get to the hardship, it really is a blessing. And so, but it's hard always to see that, right? And especially in the beginning of this, we just feel it as, a difficulty in not knowing why. It makes it even harder to bear. Before you can come to the point in your development when testing periods and times of trouble will cease, you must first go through the stage of completely understanding these periods of difficulty, and then meet them in a spirit of courage and wisdom. When you can do all this, the transition period will begin, and outer conflicts and problems will no longer touch you to the quick. You will remain quite calm and serene inside during outer hardships. So I haven't quite gotten to that, but I do believe that it's true that, that is, and part of it is like learning to have faith, learning to relax, to, go with and be present to what is. And then that activates the higher self and our more intuitive space and our heart space so that, we really can respond in a different way that brings different results, right? And so in a way, that's in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is help ourselves instead of get triggered, instead of react, instead of go into these old conditioned responses that we have from childhood or even other lifetimes, the old images that we begin to, hold ourselves and calm and trust in this flow and unfolding to realize that it's a teaching, something is trying to be revealing itself. And if we just stay present and paying attention, that is our best way of, finding our way forward. So only after this condition has been reached can hardship begin to cease altogether. You ought to be clear about the timing and the stages. So prepare yourself that these trials will not cease. Your life will outwardly continue for a while as before until you learn from it that which is so necessary for you to know. If you expect it to be this way, and if you go on the path in this frame of mind, you will not be disappointed. If you go on it like a blindfolded child full of wishful thinking, then you will be disappointed, not only in God and what you have somehow unconsciously expected from him when you chose to follow this path, but also disappointed in yourself and in your endeavors. This path is not a fairy tale. It is reality of the crassest sort, my friends. It is utter reality. Reality is not only hard and difficult and sometimes dark, but it is also more beautiful than anything else. The beauty of reality is beyond all comparison superior to the puny beauty the escapist imagination concocts to get away from unpleasant reality. Remember that. Another thought for meditation. When you go on this path, you must also prepare yourself to abide by another of the spiritual laws, which says that there is a price to be paid for everything. Whoever tries to avoid this will finally pay a much heavier price. And when I hear that, sometimes also like they have is like this negative connotation, like that I have to suffer, to receive, and I think that's a twist. But I think there is a truth that that without our own choice, our own effort, our own determination, our own sometimes sacrifice of our old patterns and like our attempts to try a different way, that we can't really achieve this. So it's like there's nothing free in that way. And if we're choosing it, that's the most important, is our free will and our deep inner choice. And sometimes that takes some work to even make that full choice and prayer. And then we can only try to live it and then pay attention, when we fall short, without judgment, without self-recrimination, but, to seek to understand and clear whatever that block was that, tripped us up in some way. So, there is a price, but I don't think, it's like, I think in our Christian imagery, sometimes we think, oh, we got to go be crucified like Jesus or something, And in some sense, there is a truth that we all are going to die, right? And we're all going to suffer maybe, in the process of the body and some other things sometimes, physical illness and health concerns, right? They're not pleasant. But, I think that to see those as kind of, and, sort of judgment. And we have these old images, like, well, if you're sick, it's God's punishment or something like that. So we have to go a little deeper, and we have to even recognize sometimes that we have these old impressions in us that we're, not so consciously aware of often. But when we sink down into the states and the feelings that, kind of come up or are accompanying, different experiences, we can discover some of these old images and beliefs that, it's beautiful to bring them to the surface, to the light, and then to bring truth to them, right? So much of the path is about bringing truth into these distortions, into these confusions, into these misunderstandings that we have as human beings here. So many people, let's see, every single person, like I messed up something here. So, and if you avoid paying any price in the long run, it's going to take a little more work and a heavier price. So every single person is sort of constantly doing this in one way or another, like subtly, secretly, trying to avoid, and we all do that, right? So again, we have to forgive ourselves. We have to be conscious as best we can that where we are. But if we moralize about it, if we turn against ourselves, if we make ourselves bad or wrong or judge, then that's just going to drive it underground. even more, right? And so we want to just, accept that, whatever, we're seeing, that's in distortion, it's costing us in some way, and to transform that will also, take some energy, some effort, some, you know, uh, letting go of things that, we've been holding on to. But we can let go of them in a supported way rather than, just trying to force it, right? So he says, when we can, the price is well worth it. When you buy a house and you want a beautiful mansion, you are reconciled to paying an adequate price. You will not expect a mansion or a palace for the price of a shack. On the material level, you have no quarrel with this truth, but on the emotional and psychological and spiritual levels, you wish for a palace for the price of a hut, and sometimes you do not want to pay any price at all. That is part of your soul sickness. The price you pay by going on this path of development is certainly a high one, but there is absolutely no other means on earth or in heaven to gain harmony, love, happiness, and complete inner security, where nothing evil can ever touch you or throw you off balance. The price is no self-pity, no self-delusion, severance with the little ego, time, effort, patience, perseverance, and courage. And so, he says in other places, like, like around severance with the little ego, like that it's really, like we're not getting rid of it, right? The ego has its place, but it's in a misaligned place. It's, in a dominant place. And so, it needs to, kind of be brought really under the command of our higher self, of our heart, and then it will function well. But, these are, all things that will help us move into self-responsibility, to let go of, our blame and our, feeling of victimization, right? Which is part of what really we can hide behind, and many people do, and we see, the struggles that we have in life, and we want to have empathy and compassion for what we've gone through. It's not about not doing that, for heaven's sakes, but it's a very subtle way that, somehow we take and make that story into our, special victimized, like thing that then holds us down and keeps us from transforming and healing it. And that's what we came in to do. So that's the price. And he says, what you will receive for this price is indeed 100 times worth it, but do not expect to see the reward right after you start. By start, I mean a period of at least 2 years of work in this manner, provided you do not work half-heartedly. In other words, and speaking symbolically, your money must first be paid in full. I know, my friends, that my words are not what a self-indulgent person likes to hear. There is no easy method and no magic formula by which you can obtain the happiness you all seek. I cannot promise you the precious gifts of heaven on earth and in the spiritual world if you merely do certain prayer exercises. If I were to tell you such things, you would be well justified in being suspicious and doubtful, even though you might undoubtedly prefer to hear this. What I am offering you is real and true. Each one of you has the chance to find out for yourself by trying and following my advice. My advice to begin with is meditate upon the words I have given you here. Consider what the price must be and what you must expect. Then make your decision. Are you willing to take this path? Oh, you may say it may take a few more lives. I am too tired. I can only answer that. This again is very short-sighted. If you are tired or weak, it is because your inner forces exhaust themselves in the wrong channels, so that your strength cannot organically renew itself as it does in a soul that functions well. If you would only start and not be dismayed by the first struggles, you would finally succeed in setting the inner current right. By doing so, you would set free in yourself a wonderful life force and a spark that will change your life completely. I cannot promise you that all your problems will cease, for they are a necessary part of your path to begin with. a challenge you can learn from if you meet them maturely. However, I can promise you that after you have fulfilled certain fundamental conditions, you will not be depressed anymore by your life and your difficulties. I can promise you that your tiredness will cease and that you'll have the strength to go through your difficulties and to bear your cross in the right way, knowing why and what it is all about. The most difficult thing for you and the most weakening aspect of your life is that you cannot see the reason for anything that happens to you. Only on a path into yourself will you find out the reason, and this alone will give you the strength you need. Furthermore, I can promise you that after a certain time on the path you will enjoy life in spite of your difficulties, even before they have actually begun to cease. You will come to relish life in a way you have never been able to do before. I can promise you will be vibrantly alive, first at intervals and later more consistently. To the extent you understand yourself and begin to put order into your soul, this vibrant life force will fill you. Life will be beautiful to you in all its reality. So I say to you, truly, do not postpone this work for another life. It will not be easier for you then, and you can never get away with not doing the work, for it has to be done. No matter how late you think it is never too late. Whatever you accomplish on this earth will have an eternal value. And when I speak of accomplishment, I do mean the conquering of your lower self. And in some ways, that word again, like this masculine way, but in the study that I've made over time, it feels really more appropriate, like that whatever, like to conquer the lower self, we really first have to see it and forgive it inside of us, accept it, forgive it, and then it can begin to change. So, it's like when we use that word conquer, I think sometimes in our culture, we, see a force of will, we see, this kind of somehow capacity in us to make ourselves change or be different. And I think that is kind of a subtle temptation, that takes us off the true path of transformation. So here's another thought, my friends, for this initial decision, which you must approach with open eyes. Distinguish the three necessary types of work involved in purifying yourself on this path. One is your outer behavior, the recognition of your apparent faults and qualities, as well as every occurrence that is on the surface. The next phase, and these phases often overlap, is tackling that layer of yourself that does not belong directly to your subconscious, but which you are unaware of because you are deliberately escaping it. This layer has to be treated in a different manner, which I will show you. The third and equally important layer is your subconscious mind. Do not believe that what is in the subconscious is so far away that it has no effect on you. You are constantly dominated by your subconscious without knowing it. It is very possible to find out slowly but surely what is in your subconscious, at least to some extent. And this is where I like to do the work with the body and the energy, because it's my real understanding that that's how we can access that subconscious. And that is where the subconscious lives, is in our bodies and, in our sensations of the energy bodies as well as our physical body. So distinguish the trends in you which stand in direct relationship to your conscious will and are thus directly controlled through an active will. You will also discover trends in you which are connected with your emotions and cannot be directly forced to respond to your wishes. The world of emotion can only change by organic growth, not by pressure and voluntary action, except in an indirect way. Let us assume you find out that deep down you are lacking faith or love. You cannot force yourself to have faith or love, no matter how hard you try directly. But what you can make yourself do is walk this path, to follow these steps, to overcome perhaps a lack of discipline that makes it so hard for you to work diligently on your path or tackle whatever else stands in your way quite directly. For instance, to work daily on your quota of self-observation and meditation in a detached way. By doing so, you will not work directly on your lack of faith or love, for instance, but you will simply get to know yourself and find out why you lack these attributes. When you gradually understand this without forcing yourself directly to have love or faith, eventually the life force will fill you and will automatically generate these feelings without any direct endeavor on your part. If your emotions begin to change after a few years, you can consider it a wonderful success. The change will happen so naturally that you may not even be fully aware of it at first. So, and this has been, my experience, and it's also like it's difficult for us to understand this. We mostly want to use our will and usually kind of a forcing current to try to make us change. And what he's saying here is, just pay attention, just notice it, and choose again, but don't recriminate yourself. Don't, forgive, let it go. And then, seek, of course, to understand more, why in that moment, what was it in me that chose that path that, took that way. So, and we can, explore that as we go, even in hindsight. And it's not so painful if we're not in a lot of critical self-judgment or self-shaming. It just becomes, our study within our own being. And it's with that study that then the change just naturally occurs. So study these words now, think about them deeply, take them to God and ask him if you have doubts. He will answer you, provided your heart is really open. So as I'm reading this, it's come across several times too. As I read this, I'm aware, right? Again, the 1950s, the language, sort of the masculine, even when we talk about the guide, he, right? The guide said that there were many beings that were involved in channeling this material, creating the material on the other side, and that kind of thing. So in some sense, the guide is probably like a they, them in many different levels. And then, when we talk about God, nowadays, it was back in those days only a masculine term. And some people want to, throw it out altogether. I like to just, try to make the words have a broader understanding, and we now no longer project God as a, old man up in the sky, right? But what we do understand in that word, maybe, in our culture is, that creator, that, larger consciousness and whatever the whole universe consists of in some ways, right? So it's the mystery, it's all of that. And I think that even the Pathwork in some of the lectures talks about the masculine and the feminine principles of God. Now that feels like it's maybe a little bit too binary gender wise, but it's more archetypal, right? And the guide is saying it's all in us. It's all in us. Some people prefer in the Pathwork lectures to use the active and receptive principles rather than the masculine and feminine. But, just a little aside there to, speak to all of that that's here now in our culture these many years later. And, to recognize that, these lectures are dated in a certain way, but that they still contain within them, a great value and truth. And we can, just let ourselves translate for ourselves, these deeper understandings that we hold now in the culture. So he's saying if we really turn to the divine and ask, that's useful, right? That it's okay to ask. And I think this is another piece where sometimes in our sort of more sophisticated understanding of the divine, we like to go to the first person God, the God within, but then it doesn't, like maybe that's the God that we're asking even, but we feel uncomfortable sometimes asking, some God out there. And yet I think, again, archetypally, it makes some sense, right? Because as human beings, we're always going to be children in some way. This world is vast. We're here. We don't understand everything. And in some way, this understanding of the divine mother, the divine father, is really where I think our transference needs should go. And oftentimes we're putting them on each other, on our mates, on our bosses, on our gurus. And so I think in some ways, that the healthiest place for our prayer, for our asking to take our needs to, and present in a sense is this larger understanding of a responsive universe, a spiritual universe, a Holy Spirit that penetrates and flows through it all and knows us and is dancing with us in a way, trying to help us realize our own blocks to our own longing, and also trying to help us materialize and bring it forth in all of its beauty and glory. So there's this, I think, way that when we ask, when we seek, from outside of ourselves in those ways, it's a kind of theurgy, right? And we're inviting all the spirits of the universe, like the trees, of the plants, of the fire, of the air, of the water, right? They all have these powers and these capacities. And so we need them, and we're shapeshifters in a way, or we have like this capacity of imagination that can, like really connect with, those faculties and capacities. So I think there is a way that as humans we're resonance chambers, we're channels, we're all, where we can invite these energies to fill us and move us and live in us and, be of our being in a way that is, like really helpful for us. And also that, in some ways our guides are waiting for, because unless we're asking, right, they can't intervene. So in that sense, also, it's like really important, I think, that when we can turn to something larger than ourselves, however you want to conceive of that, and work with that, and tuning in, listening in, following your own higher self guidance in that as well. I want to say something else to you about this phase of preparation and decision. Expect to have a fight with yourself. It will be a fight between the lower self and the higher self. Your conscious self will determine which side will win. It cannot win without such a fight. It must be a long fight, which at first manifests itself perhaps by preventing you from following this path at all. The lower self may send messages such as, I do not believe in it, or it may not be necessary after all, or it's too hard, or I have no time. It is necessary for you to recognize these messages for what they are and understand where they come from. Use them as a starting point to delve deeper into your soul. Try to see clearly what is really speaking within you when you receive these hidden excuses and pretenses. If you expect this struggle beforehand, you will be able to look and listen and will have a first victory. Also, you will have learned already to some degree the process of uncovering your mask and wrong motives, which will stand you in good stead later on when the lower self will try to obstruct your path by other means. It will simply try to hold on to individual soul currents. By then, you will already know how to deal with it a little better. Do not just put the superficial excuses aside. Test them, deal with them, examine them. Many of you are scared of what may come out of your lower self, though you may not be conscious of that fear. It is important to learn to interpret and translate such perhaps vague feelings into concise thoughts. This fear is an important reason why a person shies away from meeting the self. It is childish to imagine that whatever you do not cherish in you does not exist because you avoid facing it. The lower self is immature and ignorant. Its very nature is faults and distortions. So I say to you, do not shy away from what is in you. Many people go to psychiatrists and sometimes suffer a breakdown when they come face to face with their lower self in the course of the treatment. This cannot happen to those of you who know that your lower self is not your ultimate being. However, in psychoanalysis, the mistaken idea that you really are, that they are really their lower self, can lead people to such self-rejection and self-disgust that they break down. I think we do that to ourselves anyway, unconsciously. So it's good to be vigilant. So all of you know that the lower self is merely a temporary layer and does not constitute your entire personality. It is here now to be dealt with, but it is not the real you, at least not entirely. Your higher self, which is partly free, already manifests through your good qualities, your generosity, your kindness, or whatever else there is in you that belongs to the higher self. But even where it cannot manifest as yet, because it is deeply hidden behind the lower self, your higher self still exists in its shining perfection. How can you reach it unless you penetrate the lower self? So do not be afraid. Do not be shocked when you first encounter your lower self, where heretofore you had no idea of it. It is a necessary temporary formation, but it never, never represents the ultimate you. As a matter of fact, reaching the stage where you are shocked about some of its facets that you had not suspected constitutes a sign of improvement. It strongly implies good progress, for without going through this stage, painful as it may be for a while, you can have no further victory and success. This is part of the path, my friends. If you meditate upon these words and at the same time try to be aware of your fear of your lower self and your shame of it, and if you learn to live with this truth and knowledge, you will conquer. Then you will meet your fear realistically, and you will not be hiding from it as you are hiding from a few other things in you. This is what I have to say tonight. So he goes into several other Q&As, but let's pause here just to, see if you can integrate much of that. Does anybody want to share like anything what you took out of? That's a lot, right? And so in the beginning, reading these lectures, sometimes it's just a little bit overwhelming. So that's fine too. But anybody want to give an attempt at like what was one major point that you felt touched you or, was useful to you in some way?
I just wanted to say that early on in the lecture, they mentioned denial, and that's something that I experienced last November, the death of my mom, and there were a lot of things that I encountered with family members, and when something that huge happens in a family, there's a lot of interaction, of course. And one thing that I realized that there was such a pattern of denial in my family. And I'm just so grateful that they mentioned that, because it seems like denial might be so common in all of us at least one time in our lives, or over a long period of time maybe. But it seems like it does serve a purpose, because that's something that you have to initially break through or sort of face in order to see your truth. And they spoke about making a choice, like you have to make a choice to face these things within ourselves. And so it almost seems like denial is something that's so common, because it is something that's sort of like a first step that we have to break through. And I guess that's why it just hit me now that they say, like, what is it? Is it in the 12 steps where they say that, seeing that there's a problem is the first step, or, something of that nature. But I guess, I don't know, that was just a connection that I made, that denial is so common because it is one of the first steps on the spiritual path. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the guide is saying, we're afraid of that self-facing or facing of our experience. It boils down a lot to the facing of the feeling, right? So with the death of people, and like all of the stuff that comes up, and then like you said, in the family dynamics, it's like, yeah, there's usually a lot of denial, and in the child, even, growing up, it's like somehow if we were to face the full reality, like it may not be, so good. So we buffer it. All of these things are kind of defenses that we use for survival, right? But ideally, we get to a point in our development where, they actually are not helping us anymore. They're hindering us. And we begin to recognize, like how we're numb from the denial, or, we're missing out on, something that, starts awakening in us. And so we do make a different choice, and begin to try to face whatever's there. But yeah, good comment. Thank you. Anyone else? So I guess we can go back to the Q&A. Is everybody good to continue on a little further?
Darlene, I'm gonna drop out at this point tonight. I'm feeling pretty tired.
Tired. Okay.
Okay.
For joining us, Frank. Yeah. Good night.
Frank.
How are you doing, Laura? You following this at all?
As much as my ADD will allow, yes.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I have that too. So it's a handful. Yeah. Any reactions or any, kind of sense of connection or disconnection from it?
I mean, for me, I'm trying to think. This is all very new to me, but I'm trying to think about what my imperfections are that I've been maybe rejecting or pushing away.
Okay.
And also the idea that things that have happened in my life, I feel like the best step would be first to get to that place of love and compassion and empathy for the things that I've been through before I can get to more like the action non-victim type mentality.
Right.
Because I don't feel like I've ever even kind of got past that step.
Exactly. Yeah,
so,
good. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I think it does help to have, I mean, that's a part of it, I think, is trying to have compassion and to see the difference between, where the victim kind of puts us. And then to begin to explore, like, well, what possible reason could my soul have had to, put me in that situation? Right. And so when we begin to see our whole incarnation as a kind of soul journey process that is not just random or somehow some terrible twist of fate that we ended up with parents we did, or we struggled with the issues that we struggled with, but that there is some larger purpose to it. And I think that's I think useful sometimes, but it does take a little while, and you want to find not just the overall belief, but, really do the work inside to, make the connections and see the truth of it. And so I don't know, in the medicine ceremonies with the, with the Santo Daime ayahuasca, there's a kind of way that it's a similar sort of thing to look at our conscience, to examine the conscience, to look at our faults, because that's kind of what the medicine can help also, clear and transform. With the mushrooms, they're a little different, so I don't know, but oftentimes I think they help also people see these deeper unconscious layers and things like that, and can be a part of those works. So I don't know in your training if, you do any self-examination kind of work, in that or not, but that's what I mean when I say, like, I think that this work is good sometimes for integration of the plant medicine ceremonies. So just throw that in there for you, from your experience to consider.
Yeah, I mean, my my mushroom doses were, the first one was huge and life changing, and I still to this day am trying to integrate and understand some things that I experienced in that. Um, one of those things, I don't know if anyone has any insight about this, but I'll try to explain it as best as I can. That I feel like is related to what we're talking about. Um, I had a lot of visual things that happened. Really, really just 4 hours of mind-boggling visuals, and there were a lot of colors. Saw a lot of colors, but one of the things that came up was a my mother and my brother were in that space as a sepia color, which is kind of like that old photography of kind of like the tans and browns. Um, and the way that I've interpreted that is that that part of my family history, when it came up in the trip, it was extremely disturbing. And if I could summarize my history growing up with them, I would say it was pretty disturbing. Um, and so I do feel that one lesson that I need to learn in my life is gratitude. Um, just being grateful for whatever life has given me, but also seeing the beauty in what life has given me and things that I've been through. And for me, it's taken me years after that experience to be able to kind of see the beauty in that, because I'm a color person. I love bright, beautiful colors, and that sepia, that antique of that antique tones that came up to me. It was hard for me to find the beauty in that. Um, and the only thing that I can think to come up with that is the beauty and the contrast, because if you were to paint like the interior of your apartment or house or whatever, just only saturated bright colors, like a rainbow, I think it would be overwhelmingly bright, and that the neutral colors need to be there in order to make those colors stand out and to bring the beautiful contrast. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of the way that I've processed that, is I don't have to see the beauty in it, but I can appreciate it because it because it allows me to see the beauty and the contrast of the beautiful colors in
Uh-huh.
contrast to that. And but it's still difficult for me because I struggle still to this day with my relationships, um, with my mother and my brother and all of my family. We just all struggle with each other, and it's and maybe that's something that I could delve into as far as what my role is in that, not having a good relationship, is what are my weaknesses, instead of maybe focusing on what it is that the other people are doing or not doing. Um, and I know that every relationship has its 50-50. It's not
Mhm.
100% one or the other person.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think there is something, like, I mean, in the pathwork, certainly it's a good, what you're saying is, certainly a part of maybe that integration. And, sometimes, I mean, it is like the sepia, I mean, that's a good interpretation of it, and it also I often find that, kind of what it's reflecting something in us, right? So there's some part of you that is choosing to, keep that experience in that tone or something like that is another way of maybe, exploring that. And then, understanding, more about the pain that you still carry around that, as well as, like, well, what soul purpose or you know, what, kind of what the guide says is that we get, in those early conditions, they're, kind of the totality of reality that we know. And so we draw conclusions. The mind wants to generalize so it can protect itself, and figure the world out and stuff. So it kind of draws conclusions and they go unconscious, but we begin to generalize and say, well, the whole world is like my early family situation in some way, right? And then that influences our ability to see the beauty in similar situations, not only in that past dynamic. So we, and we start projecting sometimes the pain recycles itself through other relationships and other situations because that's not seen clearly enough, like you said, what the part of it is. And it's not, sometimes it is that, it's our own lower self that's hooked in there. And it's good to see that and understand why they're reacting to us in that way. And other times, it is just these old images and dynamics that, I mean, sometimes the healing of that, right, is not that everybody's ever going to like come together and be all lovey-dovey and completely resolved with each other, but somehow within yourself, you kind of ground in the truth, you ground in your own, self-responsibility of, working with that, and then the best kind of unfoldment can happen from there. So it sounds like, it could be a useful thing. And that's kind of, a good thing to just share here a little bit, so thanks for, offering a little more. And yeah, if you feel like you want to explore some, more on an individual level, feel free to give me a call. But that
Okay,
is
thank you.
the types of things that it's talking about, and to look at our faults and stuff. I mean, sometimes we can just make a list of all of the judgments that we have of ourselves, and then some of that is our perfectionism, and it's like not really all that significant, but some of it is, kind of some of our faults as well. So there's different ways, and it's just this. I like to work with it in terms of, well, what's up in my life, what's active inside of me, and then that kind of whatever is alive there is usually exactly where I need to pay attention and uncover and unravel and excavate a little more deeply to see how that's related to, other past things, soul issues, images, defenses, all of that. So
Okay,
anybody else? Thank you. Should we go back to the Q&A on the lecture, or does anyone else want to share? Okay, so let's go back to the lecture. So I'm going to skip this first one because somebody always wants to ask the spirits, what the other spirits do for recreation. And I don't think that that's all that important. And then some of these are more metaphysical. So, if it's not like the Pathwork guide says, there's nothing that you really have to believe, right? It comes out of a background of spiritist tradition. And it's interesting to me that a lot of times channeled material is very similar along this line, especially if you work with the old spiritist kinds of channelings. But I think sometimes these questions help us understand a little deeper. And again, I see them as kind of archetypal, in different ways that we can work with them and play with these ideas. So Question. I would like to ask whether the Christ spirit is an all-pervading spirit like God or an individual spirit. Answer. It is exactly the same as with God. The substance of Christ is the same as God's substance. It is all the divine substance. It is the same substance you have in yourself. Whether you call it the divine substance, God's substance, or Christ's substance makes no difference. And I think, in other paths, I don't know, they call it substance because that's a kind of spiritualist thing, but, like it's a state of consciousness, an awakened state or a samadhi state or something like that. So God has given most of his substance to his first creation, the spirit of Jesus Christ. All other beings, and it's like the spirit of Christ before he became Jesus, and then he incarnated as Jesus. And so now it's kind of the spirit of Jesus Christ. The Pathwork Guide has a kind of cosmology set of lectures that talks about how, the first being God created was the Christ consciousness. And then that incarnated on earth most fully in the person Jesus. And so he says all other beings have received some of this substance, and it is up to them to unfold it and enlarge it within the power given to them. So in other words, we all contain this Christ substance, consciousness, that's our essential nature, our higher self. And we're trying to expand it and, bring it more online in some sense. So if you develop yourself, you make yourself a higher self free of the shadows and layers of the lower self. That is the presence you have constantly in you if you can develop it. And this divine spark or higher self is the substance to which we are referring. The presence of God or that of Jesus Christ as a person is something else again. Christ can be felt in person as a presence in his personification, but that is something altogether different from the divine substance in you. The presence of your own divine substance inside you can only be unfolded by following this very path into which I am now leading you. To feel the presence of God in his personification, which is almost never the case with a human being, but it is possible for spirits, or to feel the presence of Jesus Christ as a person is an occasional grace which can come unexpectedly without knowing or understanding why. These are two entirely different things. And, I know people who are like completely atheists and have visitations, have had experiences of visitation of, Jesus Christ. So it's kind of a spiritual thing that is like a mystery again, but I think it's important. What he's mostly speaking thereof is that, it's like, again, even, as the incarnation of that spirit on earth, the Christ said, follow me, not worship me. So I think in a way we're here in another way, in another form of language, you could say, evolving into, the fullness of our true Christ consciousness by, clearing and purifying, the God opposed layers, the confusion, the distortion. And so, another question, and again, kind of a metaphysical one. So just to give you a taste of this, and like I said, nothing has to be believed in any of this, and so it's fine to just have whatever reactions you have to the material. I would like to ask something in connection with the fall of the angels. In Isaiah, it is said that God created good and evil. Did God create the evil forces and the Luciferic powers too? Answer, that is a great error, and you will readily understand it now when I remind you of one of the last lectures, The Fall, that explains how this error could have happened. You will remember my explaining that God created the power which he gave to each of his created spirits. This power could be used in any way depending on the spirit's free will. Now that explains why or how this error could have occurred. It is technically correct to say that God created evil, but it would be more correct to say that God created the possibility for evil if, with their free will, people or spirits use this power against divine law. Yes, but there is always the contrary to each extreme. Certainly, the opposite of divine law exists. But that does not mean that God created evil. There is a great difference between creating evil or giving free will and power to God's creatures who can then use the power according to divine law or not. I have explained very thoroughly why God gave to all beings the possibility to choose freely. Logically, free will includes the possibility of using it wrongly. If this possibility did not exist, there would be no freedom. And if God's creatures are supposed to become godlike, they must be free. For freedom is a divine aspect. The wrong use of the power ultimately led to evil through a slow process, even if it did not become evil at the first deviation. I've explained all this thoroughly. If you read that lecture, you will understand. And he says, no, I believe the passage in Isaiah may be a wrong translation, that the Lord created evil. In other words, he gives the possibility for it, but he does not create it. Exactly. You see, the omission of one word very often makes a great deal of difference in the meaning of the sentence. So how is it possible that a person on this path can be so strongly affected by environmental influences? Can you help me in this respect? Well, I can only help you by showing you how to walk the path properly, and I'm doing that. The reason why environmental influences are strong can be manifold, since there are different reasons for different people. They are primarily psychological. When the soul is strongly influenced by outer happenings of whatever kind, it is a sign that the soul is not yet free from its own entanglements. If the inner forces are not used according to divine law, the soul is not free. With one person, this will manifest in the way the environment affects you. With another, it will be different. Whether the soul is not healthy and mature, whenever the soul is not healthy and mature, certain occasions will bring this out and the soul will produce definite symptoms. But why do these symptoms occur, as in my case, when there is high humidity in the air? This happens because everybody's different odic forces. So this is a very spirituous kind of thing too, the odic forces. Like more nowadays, we talk about our energy body, right? And some people's energy bodies are stronger than others. And so for some of us, these influences penetrate and affect the soul more strongly. If you have a particular sensitivity, it is because in your own way there is a distortion in your soul, which tends perhaps to cause sluggishness and takes the first opportunity to make the soul react in this way. The soul is such a complicated mechanism. There are no two souls alike. Certain basic problems are alike, but how all these various trends and currents work, what plays into the lower self, or what the lower self will use as an excuse to reinforce a negative trait, like sluggishness, say, or where the higher self is diluted by currents of the lower self to constitute a mask or subterfuge. All this varies with each person. The possibilities are infinite, since no two people react the same way. But the fact remains that this is a sign of a disturbance within the soul, and the remedy is to continue the path to the very end, to follow this course. And so again, we have to look internally and inside of ourselves in each specific instance. So I think, this is an interesting Q&A, and this is something also that is being addressed in sort of some of the discussions in the larger Pathwork community with, the BIPOC issues and stuff like that. And again, these are somewhat dated, but, let's see what he has to say here. The question is, can you tell me if there is any spiritual significance or reason for the different races? Oh, yes, indeed. There is no such thing as coincidence. I should like to state briefly that human beings have to go through karmas. For instance, if a person is born into a certain race in which there is much collective suffering, it is, of course, due to this particular soul's karma. The more unified humanity becomes through spiritual development, the more will different races cease to exist. You can begin to see, even at this time, the slow but sure development in the direction of eliminating racial differences. In a few thousand years from now, perhaps in about 1,500 years, the effect of this development will be very noticeable. Nations, religions, and races will have few of their differences left. This will be a sign of unification and spiritual improvement. However, until such time, there will be and must be differences, for only by encountering obstacles can you grow. This holds true for the individual's life, and it certainly applies to the development of groups. You may wonder why certain races do not suffer from being different from others. Then you might ask, what can they learn from that? Indeed, they too have something to learn. Perhaps they need to learn the responsibility that arises from being spared sufferings that other people may have. Besides, this angle is not the only one to be considered. A spirit can be born into a race or nation because spiritually, emotionally, character-wise, and psychologically, it belongs to this group and therefore has the best opportunity to unfold there. Differences will exist as long as disunity exists on earth, and humanity has not learned to overcome it. As any difficulty or apparent disadvantage can be a cure, which it must be if the person is on the right path, advantage can be a cure too. Through differences of race, religion, nationality, or various other categories, humanity can become stronger and advance faster in spiritual development, precisely because frictions exist. Without friction, development can never proceed. It is only a question of how the difficulty is met, always how it is met individually and collectively. Is that clear? Yes, thank you. But is not the variety of different races and their trends part of the beauty of life? Yes, the variety is fine, but variety on your earth means friction and hostility. In spirit, there is infinite variety in everything, but it is unlike that on your earth, where you have what you call better races and inferior races. That, of course, is karmic for both groups and not only for the groups which are sometimes persecuted. This is also a thought upon which you can now meditate. Is there something wrong if working on this path of development? Okay, so this is leaving that question. So let me just pause. It's like some of the things that, are coming out a little more certainly is, this awareness of kind of an unconscious dominance that is, really affecting people. And so, while the guide is mostly speaking here, I think of kind of the self-responsibility and the kind of uniqueness of each soul journey and the choices that we make and the karma that we're working with, that also, I think that this is a time when we're, really trying to become more conscious of, sort of, the way that, dominant culture in general, our patriarchy, our, the racism that comes from some of this. And it seems very ancient when you go back to it, but it certainly is still having a current effect and seems to be, importantly rising to the surface again for us all to, again, face, get out of denial, notice what we feel, be able to be confronted. I mean, one of the things that so often happens, I think, for people that are working with this now is that there's a lot of sort of white fragility, in some of the confrontations that are happening, and people don't even maybe recognize the unconscious dominance that they're operating under. And so it's a tender time, and ideally I think the guide has a good approach that doesn't allow victimization. I think not even ultimately in the racist thing, that there's a reason why each one chose and has undergone these experiences, and it's, certainly also a collective reason. And maybe that part of their journey is about, transforming, in that way, out of the limitations of that kind of consciousness. But we're also, I think, confronting sort of the ways that we're unconsciously, staying locked in harmful, like the consequences. Like they talk about there's impact and there's intent. And so most white people, I don't think, have an intent to be offensive, but I think that there is impact there sometimes when they're so unconscious about it. So we're all trying to wake up and try to see a little more, behind the veil and all of that. And like I said, this is a dated path. And so we want to try to have these discussions and dialogues available within current, classes and groups and stuff working with it. And we're also dealing a lot with our ancestral and clan patterns and things like that, that often go with, these collective traumas, and that's being brought out into understanding and openness in the epigenetics, how it's actually even carried in our bodies, right? So all of this is really important new stuff that's coming in. So, question, is there something wrong if working on this path of development, you find that you have one particular fault and you are trying to overcome it through meditation and prayer, yet don't seem to get further along? I will not say that there is something wrong, but I would say that some method or of some key that you need is lacking. You try hard again and again in one particular direction, perhaps too forcefully. Your lower self resists that. And maybe I can help you by saying this. My dear friend, you must realize one thing. When I spoke about the battle and said fight, I mean just that. It takes the lower self a long time to become ready to give up its faults, its resentments, its sluggish ways. You must realize that the lower self lives in you strongly, even though you are not aware of it consciously and do not see its significance. Because consciously, you only know your goodwill to work in the right direction. So this is where, when we're in our life, we're aware of our desire, our longing, our goodwill, and yet it's not happening, that we're being thwarted. Then we really do have to realize that there's probably another unconscious will inside of us that's going in the opposite direction. And unless we can bring that into consciousness, into the light of awareness, we can't work with it. So he says this realization is the first essential step. Without making this realization, you can get nowhere, no matter how good the will of your conscious being is. What most people do not accept, at least not until a pretty distant point is reached on this path, is the discrepancy in themselves. How one part can want one thing, while another part wants exactly the opposite. This conflict of opposite desires, which at first is always subconscious, must be taken out and brought into the light of consciousness. Without this essential step, there can be no further success. Therefore, my advice is to not try to, for the moment, to force yourself to feel what you have been so far incapable of feeling. Instead, use your efforts in the direction of making that part of you conscious that is responsible for your lack of success so far. Relax completely, not only physically, but also emotionally. Then try to let your lower self come to the surface so that you can actually become aware of it. Invite it to speak, listen to the no, the negativity in whatever form, I don't want it, like when your enemy becomes visible, you can fight successfully. As long as your enemy is invisible, you cannot succeed. So do not be afraid to let out what is in you. Very quietly say to yourself and in your meditations to God, this is the way I am now. At least a part of me is this way. The part I do not like or cherish. I want to accept this aspect as part of my being, knowing that I cannot change anything without doing so freely. I realize that what will manifest is not my whole being, but there are two contradictory forces in me, and I have to become aware of both, including the one I have so far ignored. In order to become what I would like to be, I must first, without fear or shame and vanity, face what is in me. Ask God to help you to achieve that end. And what that is, what is in us is whatever the resistance is, like the inner no. God has another lecture on the yes and the no currents, right? And so we have the yes current. I want to grow spiritually. I want to learn. I want to face what's in me. And then we have the unconscious that's afraid, that resists, that doesn't, really want to see because it's afraid of being ashamed or blamed or something like that. So that's a part of why we want to not blame and shame it, and just accept and try to understand it. Who were you when you did that? Why do you feel that way? Right. So we want to bring out these hidden parts of ourselves that are in the background. Ask God to help you achieve that end, and then let the lower self come out. Listen to your feelings in connection with incidents that have always brought out this trend in you. Then try to translate these feelings into concise thoughts and words. Do this constantly, and you will be successful in this respect. You will then come to the point when you can quietly realize these two contradictory currents in you, the one in which you see your imperfection, and the opposite one where you know in theory how you would like to feel and react, even though you cannot as yet do so. First, compare these two currents and learn for the time being to accept your present imperfection in comparison with the perfection you know to be right. Accept this imperfection with humility. If you do that constantly, your feelings will change. Constant self-observation and self-honesty will have a surprising effect on you. By following this procedure, you will learn to follow the law of reality, accepting yourself as you are, and thus learning true humility. This awareness will generate a new strength in you even before you have attained perfection in this respect. After a period of this kind of training, very gradually your feelings will begin to change. This is the only way, my dear. I mean to talk about this topic in a following lecture, but since your question came up, it is good for all of you that I answered it now. I will come back to this because it constitutes the method of purification of emotions, not influenced by an act of direct willpower. This cannot be emphasized enough. It often takes some time until this method is clearly understood, but once it is, it cannot fail to bring results. Some of you may get bored hearing this again and again, especially those of my friends who have heard this from me in their private sessions, but I cannot say it often enough. Many of you have understood this process only in your brain, but your inner self has yet to perceive or understand it entirely. Yes, how do you get your inner self to understand the emotional self? You do not try to make it understand to begin with. Let it out first. That is the first half of the process. You cannot educate or re-educate your emotional self before it is completely on the surface. To be in a hurry, and this is where we repress and deny, right, what we're feeling inside. So, it's like welcoming it, bringing it out in a safe way. It's not talking about acting it out with everybody, but, in your sessions or in your meditation, to go in and journal, write out what you're feeling, what's really there. And to be in a hurry to change these emotions is not only an impossible goal, and therefore your hurry is futile and unrealistic, but this period of constant self-recognition, where you make comparisons between your emotions which conflict with what you have long recognized as being right, teaches you humility. To accept yourself as an imperfect being is accepting yourself in the right way without guilt feelings and self-abuse. The latter are unhealthy and unproductive. You must learn to take yourself realistically and say, in so many respects, I am still imperfect. In so many others, I have reached perfection. If in the work on this path, I should find out that I am less perfect than I thought, I will accept this too in order to be able to change it. Realize that before your imperfections can change, you have so many other things to learn from this very imperfection in you. Learn the proper attitude with which to meet your lower self. Accept your inability to change something by mere effort of will. All this is necessary on your path, and therefore the still existing imperfections fulfill a definite purpose. This does not mean that you should nurse them, justify their existence, or worse, become lazy and do not do anything about them. This would be the wrong opposite extreme. To find the right middle path in everything is part of the path. Learn to accept yourself without fear, without shame, and without pride. Where you still discover these trends, examine what is behind them and gain further understanding about yourself. If you follow this system for a while and ask at the same time for God's grace to help you, you will get further and further. Although you will not change these currents immediately, you will grow in self-recognition and self-understanding. However, this is fundamental. The proper spirit of accepting the lower self with the necessary humility is of much great importance than any of you realize as yet. You mistakenly want to skip this phase altogether, and by so doing, you will inevitably become discouraged eventually, because your endeavors will always wind up in a dead-end street. And now I will retire, my dear friends. God's blessings to all of you, my dear friends far away, and to all of you, my dear friends in this room, as well as to those who have found their way to us for the first time tonight. May this be a turning point in their lives. Peace be with you. Be in God. Okay, we got all the way through. It's a lot of material there. So just kind of absorb it like a sponge, what connects, what gets, and it works. I like the last Q&A part, and it really is a good description, I think, of this process. So, if you ever, think to, refer back to that, that's a good, the very last, series of questions in that lecture. I thought he, helped explain, like this balance of facing and humility and working with all of this stuff. So does it make sense? Does it feel useful or just overwhelming, or how are you doing?
I thought it was very useful. Absolutely.
So very good. So we'll continue, I think, in 2 weeks with this class, and then next Wednesday is the class that I have on the different sacred plant medicines. If people want to join that one, it's kind of an open group and free as well. And I don't know, not everybody on this call is into that thing, so it's no pressure or anything like that. But that's also just on the list of things. So let me know if you want to join, and we will see you in 2 weeks, if not before. Do I have a session with you, Trini, scheduled on the books? Did you want to do another individual one at some point?
I think I definitely would like to. I haven't thought of when. I've got some
Yeah, give me a
doctor's
call.
appointments. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no problem. I couldn't remember, and sometimes my mind and I forget to write something down, and I didn't want to miss you if
Oh,
if
thank
we had
you.
something, but no pressure, but just if you do, let me know.
Thank you. Is the session about the plants, is that next Wednesday at 7:30?
Next Wednesday night, yeah, 7:30.
Okay, okay. I think I'd like to attend that.
Okay, how are you doing, Al?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the session. It's there is some getting used to the language, but it was really interesting for me because he talked a lot about the struggle involved in the process, and that's usually my experience, but for some reason I found it really meditative, and I don't know, calming and helpful in some indefinable way, which is not not usually what happens with me, but it did in the session.
Good.
So thank you.
Great. Yeah. And I think we all have this spiritual disease, that gives us anxious and pressured and stuff with this. So like, to me as well, like sometimes he'll take me, it's calming and soothing, and, realizing, it's like, it's a big journey. we on a huge piece. Life is immense, and, and just, it's all good, but it requires what it takes. And all of this is, like, we think be a certain way, and it's not, but there's deep learning going on in our experiential process of just living our life. And I was thinking today, going back over the changes that I've seen in my journey, of evolution, and so much of it has felt like, it's kind of how he described it there. You work and you work and you work, you keep looking at it, you keep seeing it, you pray about it. You would like to change it, you forgive yourself, whatever. And then all of a sudden you kind of look back and you notice, well, I'm not doing that as much anyway, or, and so it's kind of like there's a way that when the ego thinks, oh, I need to affect this right away, that it's missing a larger point, that it's not done from the ego, it's done in the whole organism. And it's through the trial and error, the learning curve, the experiential aspect of life that we internalize and integrate, all of these truths and teachings and understandings. So it, to me is as well like, ooh, I don't have to be wise yet,
Yeah, well, however it happened, it was a really nice experience tonight. So
Great. Okay, well, very good. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining. And
Good night.
good night.
Thank you. Good night.
good night.
I'll try to be there next week.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.